Security! Drag this homeless trash out immediately!
The crystal chandeliers sparkled like frozen tears above the most exclusive Christmas party in the city. Designer gowns swept marble floors while champagne glasses clinked in celebration of wealth and status. Thomas, 55, emerged from the basement covered in coal dust and ash, his worn flannel shirt a stark contrast to the sea of tuxedos. He was just the handyman, invisible, insignificant, forgotten. But fate had other plans. As he carefully navigated through the crowd, trying to remain unseen, Thomas accidentally bumped into the host, Richard Morrison, real estate mogul worth $50 million. Coal dust scattered across Richard's pristine Italian leather shoes like dirty snow on fresh silk. The entire room fell silent. Richard's face twisted with disgust. "You filthy peasant! I hired you to fix the furnace downstairs. Who gave you permission to contaminate my living room?" His voice boomed across the mansion. "Security! Drag this human trash out immediately. He's ruining the atmosphere for civilized people." Thomas lowered his head in shame, coal dust falling from his weathered flannel shirt like black snow. The security guard stepped forward, ready to escort him out through the service entrance where he belonged. But something stopped him cold. His eyes locked onto the glass display case in the corner of Richard's opulent living room. Inside, bathed in golden spotlight, sat a violin that made his heart skip a beat, a genuine Stradivarius from 1721, worth $5 million, the same model he had restored for the Queen of England 15 years ago, and it was in mortal danger. Thomas noticed the industrial humidifier positioned directly beside the display case, pumping moisture into the air at maximum setting. The antique wood was already beginning to show signs of stress. "Mr. Morrison," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible above the Christmas music. "Sir, your humidity level is at 70%. That 300-year-old alpine spruce is experiencing hygroscopic expansion. The violin is going to crack." Richard spun around, his face red with embarrassment that this dirty handyman was still speaking in front of his wealthy guests. "What did you just say to me?" "The wood fibers are absorbing moisture and swelling beyond their natural capacity. When old-growth spruce reaches that saturation point, the grain structure fails catastrophically. You need to move that humidifier immediately, or..." A furnace repairman is lecturing a billionaire about fine art? Richard's laughter echoed through the mansion. "Listen, you pathetic coal-covered peasant. I paid more for that violin than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes. I don't need maintenance advice from someone who crawls through basements for a living." The guests chuckled, sipping their champagne as they watched the spectacle unfold. Thomas felt the familiar tremor in his hands, the same shake that had haunted him since the accident 15 years ago. He was Thomas Whitmore, master luthier to European royalty. His workshop in Vienna was legendary. Princes and conductors would wait months just for a consultation, until that terrible December night. Sarah had been working late in the shop, varnishing a 1698 Guarneri. The space heater malfunctioned. The explosion took everything: his wife, his workshop, his steady hands, and his faith in himself. The trauma left him with a neurological tremor that made precision work impossible. A master craftsman who could no longer craft, he fled to America, changed his name, and buried his expertise beneath layers of shame and manual labor for 15 years. He had been just Thomas the handyman, invisible, forgotten, safe, but tonight, watching that priceless instrument slowly destroy itself, the old fire ignited in his chest. "You're making a mistake," he whispered. "The only mistake here is allowing vermin into my home." Richard sneered. "Guards, remove this delusional fool before he tracks more filth on my Persian rugs." Thomas backed toward the door, but his eyes never left the violin. Through the frosted window, he could see his rusty pickup truck in the driveway. Inside, his 8-year-old grandson Leo sat waiting, clutching the wooden horse Thomas had carved for him. Leo was autistic and nonverbal, but he understood more than most adults. He was the only family Thomas had left. The $200 Richard owed him for tonight's furnace repair would buy Leo's monthly medication. Without it, the boy would spend Christmas in the hospital. Thomas reached for the door handle. Defeated, he had spoken up and been humiliated, just like always, just like the broken man he had become. But as his calloused fingers touched the brass, he heard it, the faintest crack of wood fiber giving way. The violin was dying. Thomas had barely reached the iron gate when the sound erupted from the mansion behind him, a sharp, sickening crack that cut through the Christmas music like a scream. He stopped dead in the snow, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He knew that sound. Every luthier did. It was the sound of centuries-old wood surrendering to forces beyond its capacity to endure. The Stradivarius had just died, through the frosted windows. Thomas could see the chaos unfolding inside. Guests were gasping and pointing at the display case. Richard was frantically waving his hands, his face pale as fresh snow. The violin's top plate had warped severely, causing the bridge to snap and fly across the room like a wooden bullet. 300 years of craftsmanship destroyed in seconds. Thomas should have felt vindicated. He had warned them. He had tried to prevent this disaster. But all he felt was the hollow ache of watching something irreplaceable die while he stood powerless to save it. He turned toward his pickup truck, where Leo sat patiently in the passenger seat, his small hands carefully cradling the wooden horse Thomas had carved for him. The boy's medication could wait another month. Somehow, they would manage. Sir, wait! Thomas heard running footsteps crunching through the snow behind him. Richard's butler, Charles, was sprinting toward him in his formal tuxedo, his breath coming in desperate gasps. Please, Charles panted, grabbing Thomas's arm. Mr. Morrison needs you back inside immediately. It's an emergency. I think he made his position quite clear, Thomas replied quietly, not turning around. You don't understand. Lord Sterling, the violin's owner. He's arriving in 18 minutes. He's flying in from London specifically to perform that piece for the governor's wife tonight. If he sees what happened. Charles's voice cracked with panic. Mr. Morrison will be ruined, completely destroyed. Thomas almost smiled at the irony. The same man who had called him human trash was now begging for his help. That's not my problem anymore, Thomas said, reaching for his truck door. He'll pay you $10,000. The words hung in the frozen air between them. $10,000. Leo's medication for 5 years. A real Christmas. Maybe even a small apartment where the heat actually worked. But Thomas shook his head. Money can't fix 3 centuries of damage in 18 minutes. That violin is beyond repair. Charles grabbed his arm more desperately. Please, just look at it. Mr. Morrison says you seem to know something about violins. Maybe there's something you can do. Anything. Against his better judgment, Thomas found himself being led back through the service entrance into the mansion's chaos. Richard was pacing frantically while his wealthy guests huddled around the shattered display case like mourners at a funeral. When Richard saw Thomas, his desperation overcame his earlier arrogance. You said something about wood expansion. Fix it. You warned me this would happen, so you must know how to undo it. Thomas approached the display case and winced. The damage was even worse than he had feared. The violin's top plate had buckled, creating a valley where it should have been perfectly flat. The bridge had snapped in half, and the strings hung loose like broken promises. Sir, Thomas said quietly, this instrument is beyond any normal repair. The wood fibers have been permanently stressed. Even if I could straighten the top plate, it would never resonate properly again. Then make it look good enough to fool Sterling for one evening. Richard's voice was borderline hysterical. He's nearly 80 years old with failing eyesight. Maybe he won't notice the details in dim lighting. Thomas stared at Richard in disbelief. You want me to create a facade? To deceive one of the world's greatest living violinists with a cosmetic patch job? I'll pay you $50,000. The entire room fell silent. $50,000. Thomas's hands began to tremble, not from his old injury, but from the magnitude of what was being asked. "Sir," the butler whispered urgently, "Lord Sterling's limousine just pulled into the driveway. We have maybe 12 minutes." Thomas looked through the window at his truck, where Leo was now sleeping peacefully against the passenger window, still clutching his wooden horse. The boy trusted him completely, believed in him, needed him. But what Richard was asking wasn't repair. It was deception. It was everything Thomas had spent 15 years running from. The shortcuts, the compromises, the lies that had cost him everything once before. "I can't," Thomas began. $100,000, Richard screamed. "Cash, tonight? Just make it look right for 2 hours." Thomas closed his eyes and saw Sarah's face the night she died. She had always told him that his gift was too precious to waste on anything less than perfection. But she was gone, and Leo was here. And the boy needed medicine more than the world needed another purist. When Thomas opened his eyes, his hands had stopped shaking. "Get me a set of micrometers, surgical clamps, and every grain of sawdust you vacuumed from this room tonight," he said quietly. "And turn off every humidifier in this house, if I'm going to attempt the impossible. I need perfect environmental conditions." Richard nearly fainted with relief. "You can fix it?" Thomas knelt beside the broken violin, his weathered fingers hovering just above the damaged wood. "I can try to save its soul." Thomas knelt before the shattered violin like a surgeon approaching a dying patient. The mansion's guests gathered in a silent semicircle, their champagne glasses forgotten as they watched the coal-covered handyman transform before their eyes. "Charles, I need absolute silence," Thomas commanded, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been heard in 15 years. One vibration, one footstep, one whisper could ruin everything. This wood is traumatized. It will respond to the slightest disturbance. Richard checked his Rolex obsessively. 11 minutes. Sterling's limousine is in the driveway. Thomas ignored him, his focus laser-sharp on the instrument. The violin's top plate had buckled into a valley nearly 3 millimeters deep. Catastrophic damage that would typically require months of careful restoration. But tonight, he didn't have months. He had minutes. "The cellular structure of the spruce has been compressed beyond its natural elasticity," Thomas murmured, more to himself than to the audience. "The wood grain is fighting against itself. I need to convince it to remember its original shape." He began by carefully removing the broken bridge and loosened strings. His hands, which had trembled with shame just minutes ago, now moved with surgical precision. Muscle memory from thousands of hours spent in Viennese workshops was awakening like a sleeping giant. "Mr. Morrison, do you have a humidor in this house?" "Yes. In my study. Cuban cigars. Why?" "I need Spanish cedar shavings, fresh ones, and a bottle of your oldest whiskey, something aged in oak barrels for at least 20 years. Richard looked bewildered but sent his butler running. Thomas continued his examination, running his fingers along the violin's damaged surface with the delicacy of a lover's caress. "The wood fibers haven't actually snapped," he announced to the mesmerized crowd. "They've been stretched and displaced. If I can reintroduce controlled moisture at precisely the right temperature, combined with gradual pressure application, I might be able to coax them back into alignment." Charles returned with Spanish cedar and a bottle of 1987 Macallan whiskey. Thomas's eyebrows raised slightly. This bottle alone was worth more than most people's cars. "I need you to shave these cedar pieces into the finest possible curls," Thomas instructed Charles. "Each curl should be no thicker than human hair. While you do that, I'm going to prepare a restoration medium." Thomas opened the whiskey and inhaled deeply. Oak-aged spirits contain natural wood resins that can temporarily soften spruce fibers. The alcohol will evaporate, leaving behind microscopic amounts of compatible organic compounds. He dampened a piece of fine silk with the whiskey and began dabbing it along the violin's damaged areas. The alcohol penetrated the ancient wood like medicine entering a bloodstream. "Now comes the dangerous part," Thomas announced. I need to create internal pressure to push the wood fibers back into position, but one wrong move will shatter the entire instrument into worthless fragments. He reached into his tool bag and produced a small medical syringe. The crowd gasped as Thomas pricked his own thumb with the needle, drawing blood. "Are you insane?" Richard shrieked. "You're bleeding on a $5 million violin. Blood contains natural proteins that act as organic binding agents," Thomas replied calmly, mixing his blood with the whiskey solution. Medieval luthiers use blood and egg whites routinely. The proteins will help stabilize the wood fibers during the reshaping process. Using the finest brush he could find, Thomas applied the crimson mixture to the violin's internal stress points. The wood seemed to drink the solution hungrily, its color deepening slightly as the fibers began to respond. 7 minutes! Richard was nearly hyperventilating. Thomas retrieved the Spanish cedar shavings and began placing them strategically inside the violin's body. These will create controlled humidity as they release moisture, combined with gentle heat from my hands. They'll encourage the wood to remember its original shape. He positioned his palms on either side of the violin's damaged area and began applying pressure with the patience of a master craftsman. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the warped wood began to respond. The valley in the top plate grew shallower. "Impossible," whispered an elderly guest. "He's actually reshaping it." Thomas's concentration was absolute. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the mansion's coolness. This was more than repair work. This was communion with centuries of craftsmanship. He could feel the violin's history flowing through his fingers, the Italian master who had carved it, the countless musicians who had breathed life into it, the songs it had sung across 3 centuries. "The wood is responding," Thomas announced softly. "But I need to rebuild the bridge and reset the sound post before Sterling arrives. The sound post is the violin's soul. If its position is off by even a millimeter, the entire instrument will sound lifeless." Using a specialized tool called a sound post setter, which he improvised from a coat hanger and medical forceps, Thomas began the delicate process of positioning the small wooden cylinder inside the violin's body. This required working blind, guiding the post by feel and acoustic feedback alone. 3 minutes! Richard was practically in tears. Thomas plucked the G-string gently. The note that emerged was weak but true. He adjusted the sound post fractionally and tried again. This time, the note bloomed with rich, warm resonance that filled the room like liquid gold. "Listen," Thomas commanded the awestruck crowd. He played a simple scale, and the violins sang with a voice that seemed to echo from centuries past. The repair was holding. More than holding, it was thriving. The front door burst open. Lord Sterling entered the mansion, his silver hair gleaming and his walking cane tapping against the marble floor. He was accompanied by the governor's wife and several distinguished guests. Richard's face went white as fresh snow. Thomas stepped back from the violin, his hands covered in blood and whiskey, his clothes torn from the frantic repair work. "Good evening, everyone," Lord Sterling announced in his cultured British accent. "I do hope I'm not late for tonight's performance. Is my dear Stradivarius ready for her debut?" Thomas looked at the repaired violin, then at Richard's terrified face, then at the approaching CEO who held his future in his hands. Everything depended on the next 60 seconds. Richard moved faster than lightning. The moment Lord Sterling's voice echoed through the mansion, he snatched the violin from Thomas's blood-stained hands and stepped protectively in front of the display case. "Lord Sterling, welcome to my humble home," Richard announced with his practiced millionaire smile, the violin cradled in his arms like a rescued child. "I do apologize for the minor delay. We were just making some final adjustments to ensure your Stradivarius was in perfect condition for tonight's performance." Lord Sterling approached with the elegant bearing of British nobility, his sharp eyes immediately drawn to the violin. Behind him walked Governor Harrison's wife, along with several distinguished guests who had come specifically to hear the legendary instrument. "Ah, my precious 1721, Lord Sterling murmured affectionately, reaching for his violin. "She's been through quite a journey today, flying from London, I do hope the climate change didn't affect her temperament. Thomas watched in stunned silence as Richard smoothly handed over the instrument, his earlier panic completely masked by aristocratic charm. Actually, you're quite perceptive, Richard continued smoothly. We did notice some minor humidity issues when the violin arrived. Fortunately, I have some experience with antique wood preservation from my art collection, a few small adjustments to the environmental controls. And she's performing beautifully now. Lord Sterling ran his fingers along the violin's surface, his experienced touch immediately detecting the subtle changes in the wood grain. His eyebrows raised slightly, but he said nothing. Thomas felt his stomach twist into knots. This was exactly what Sarah had warned him about 15 years ago. The wealthy stealing credit from the craftsman who actually did the work. But back then, he had been naive enough to believe that skill and honesty would always be recognized. Richard, who is this gentleman? Lord Sterling asked, nodding toward Thomas, who stood awkwardly in his torn, blood-stained clothing. Oh, him? Richard waved dismissively. Just my maintenance staff. He was helping move some equipment. Thomas, wasn't it? You can head home now. We'll settle your bill later. The casual dismissal hit Thomas like a physical blow. 45 minutes ago, this same man had been begging him, offering him $100,000 to save his reputation. Now he was being discarded like a used tissue. Actually, Lord Sterling said thoughtfully, I noticed some interesting restoration work on the bridge area. Quite sophisticated technique. Who performed this craftsmanship? Richard's confidence faltered for just a moment. Well, as I mentioned, I have extensive experience with. The blood residue suggests emergency field repair work. Lord Sterling interrupted, his voice sharp with professional curiosity. This appears to be authentic medieval restoration technique using organic binding agents. Remarkable work. Where did you learn such methods? Thomas watched Richard's face cycle through confusion, panic, and desperate calculation. The man was drowning, and Thomas held the only life preserver. Thomas, Richard said quietly, stepping closer with a forced smile. Could I speak with you privately for just one moment? A small matter regarding your compensation. They moved to the corner of the room, away from Lord Sterling's penetrating gaze. Richard's hand went to his jacket pocket, withdrawing a thick envelope. $500,000, Richard whispered urgently. Cash. Tonight. All you have to do is walk out that door and never mention what happened here. Tell anyone who asks that you were fixing the furnace in the basement all evening. Thomas stared at the envelope. $500,000. Leo's medication for life. A real home. College education. A future his grandson deserved. Think about your grandson, Richard continued, his voice honey smooth with persuasion. That little boy needs you to be practical, not prideful. What good is your integrity if he's suffering in some state-run facility because you couldn't afford his care? The words cut deep because they were partially true. Thomas looked through the window at his rusted pickup truck, where Leo was still sleeping peacefully, trusting that his grandfather would always find a way to take care of him. In this moment, Thomas thought, I have to choose who I really am. He could take the money and walk away. He could let Richard claim credit for a miracle that had cost Thomas his own blood and 15 years of suppressed expertise. He could buy Leo's security with the price of his own soul, or he could stand up for the truth, knowing it might cost them everything. Thomas looked at the envelope in Richard's manicured hands, then at his own calloused fingers still stained with violin restoration work. Somewhere in his memory, he heard Sarah's voice on their wedding day. Promise me you'll never let money make you forget who you are. Keep your blood money, Thomas said quietly, stepping back from the envelope. Some things aren't for sale. Richard's face twisted with rage and desperation. You're making the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. Without this money, you'll lose everything. I already lost everything once, Thomas replied, meeting his gaze steadily. I survived it then. I'll survive whatever comes next. He turned toward Lord Sterling, who had been watching the entire exchange with the keen interest of a man who had seen every form of human behavior during his 8 decades of life. "Your lordship," Thomas said, his voice carrying quiet dignity, "I believe you had some questions about the restoration work." Lord Sterling's eyes widened in recognition as Thomas stepped forward. The elderly nobleman dropped his walking cane with a resounding clatter against the marble floor. "Thomas Whitmore," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "My God, it's really you!" The entire room fell into stunned silence. Richard's face drained of all color. "I've been searching for you for 5 years," Lord Sterling continued, his voice gaining strength. "The legendary master luthier who vanished after the Vienna workshop tragedy. You restored my wife's 1698 Guarneri the year before she passed. She said your hands held magic itself." Thomas stood frozen as Lord Sterling approached him with reverence typically reserved for royalty. "This man," Lord Sterling announced to the bewildered crowd, "is not maintenance staff. He is the greatest violin restorer alive. European royalty would wait years just for a consultation. I myself flew to Austria 3 times, offering him blank checks to restore instruments in my collection." Richard's legs nearly buckled. That's impossible. He's just a master craftsman whose skill you could never comprehend." Lord Sterling cut him off sharply. "Mr. Morrison, you didn't save this violin. You nearly destroyed a priceless piece of history through gross negligence. This man performed a miracle to undo your carelessness." Lord Sterling lifted the violin and played a haunting melody. The notes that emerged were pure, liquid gold, filling the mansion with ethereal beauty that brought tears to several guests' eyes. "Perfect restoration," he announced. "Master Whitmore, I offer you $2 million in a private workshop to work exclusively on my collection." Thomas looked through the window at Leo, who was now awake and watching through the glass with curious eyes. The boy was making the hand gestures they used to communicate, asking if everything was okay. "Your lordship," Thomas said quietly, "I'm honored, but I must decline your generous offer. However, I would accept your help with something far more important." 6 months later, Thomas stood in a bright, warm workshop filled with specialized tools and laughing children. Above the door hung a simple wooden sign, "The Leo Foundation, Music Therapy for Special Needs Children." Lord Sterling had funded the entire project. Richard Morrison had lost every business contract and social connection after the truth emerged, and Thomas had found something more valuable than any fortune: purpose, dignity, and the joy of watching Leo teach other children how to carve wooden horses. In our modern world obsessed with appearances and status symbols, we often judge books by their covers and people by their paychecks. Thomas's story reminds us of a timeless truth that bears repeating in every generation. True worth lies not in what we own, but in what we can create, preserve, and heal. The hands that look the roughest may hold the gentlest touch. The person wearing work clothes may possess knowledge that surpasses any university education. The quiet individual standing in the corner may carry decades of wisdom earned through both triumph and heartbreak. Richard Morrison had everything money could buy. Yet when crisis struck, he was utterly powerless. Thomas had nothing but calloused hands and a wounded heart, yet he possessed the skill to perform miracles. Character isn't measured by bank statements or zip codes. It's revealed in the choices we make when no one is watching, and in our willingness to sacrifice for something greater than ourselves. The next time you encounter someone society might overlook, the custodian, the repair technician, the elderly person sitting alone, remember Thomas. Behind every weathered face lies a story of resilience, expertise, and dreams that refuse to die. If you believe that kindness and integrity matter more than wealth and status, you've found your tribe. Subscribe Hero Dad Stories to join our community of people who see the extraordinary in the ordinary, and who know that the most powerful stories are often found in the quietest hearts. Together, we'll continue sharing tales of hidden heroes and second chances, Thank you for believing in the power of the human spirit.